One man, 200 enemies, a snow-covered forest in Belgium. When his entire unit was wiped out, he didn't surrender. He picked up his rifle and made history. This is the story of the U.S. soldier who faced 200 Germans alone and survived to tell the tale. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The world was witnessing Hitler's final desperate gamble, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. For the American forces stationed here, this was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place to rest battle-weary troops. They had no idea they were about to face the largest German offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. The date was December 16th, 1944. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the earth shook. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across an 80-mile front. For 90 minutes, shells rained down on unsuspecting American positions. The surprise was total. The devastation was unprecedented. Private First Class John McKinney of the 1st Infantry Division was just 22 years old. Like thousands of other American soldiers, he thought he was in for a quiet Christmas in the Belgian woods. He was about to discover that war has no regard for holiday wishes. The American lines were thinly held. Fatigued troops and inexperienced replacements had been stationed here because commanders believed the dense forest terrain made a major German assault impossible. They were wrong. Dead wrong. McKinney's squad was positioned near a small Belgian village, just one of hundreds of tiny outposts scattered across the Ardennes. They had been ordered to hold the line at all costs, but nobody expected the cost to be this high. As dawn broke on December 16th, the German artillery barrage finally ended, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosions. Through the smoke and snow, dark shapes began moving between the trees. German infantry, hundreds of them. McKinney's squad of 12 men had survived the initial bombardment by diving into a concrete bunker left over from World War I. But as they peered through the gun slots, they realized the full horror of their situation. This wasn't a probe. This wasn't a limited attack. This was a full-scale invasion. The squad sergeant was the first to see them clearly. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "There must be 200 of them." German soldiers in white winter camouflage were advancing through the forest in perfect formation. Machine guns, mortars, tank support in the distance. This was a full Wehrmacht assault unit. McKinney checked his rifle, an M1 Garand with 8 rounds. He had 4 extra clips on his belt, 32 bullets total, against 200 men. The German force was led by veteran troops from the 6th Panzer Army. These weren't green recruits. These were hardened soldiers who had been fighting since 1941. They moved with precision, communicating through hand signals, advancing using textbook infantry tactics. At 7:15 a.m., the first German scout appeared just 50 yards from the bunker. McKinney could see his face clearly through the morning mist. A young soldier, maybe 18 years old, scanning the American position with binoculars. The squad held their breath. Maybe they hadn't been spotted. Maybe the Germans would pass by. Maybe they could wait for reinforcements. Then the scout raised his hand and pointed directly at their position. The sergeant made the call. "Open fire! Take as many as you can!" 12 American rifles erupted simultaneously. The first wave of German attackers dropped, but there were so many more behind them. The forest came alive with muzzle flashes. The Germans returned fire with overwhelming force. Machine gun bullets chewed through the trees above the bunker. For 20 minutes, the firefight raged. McKinney fired his M1 Garand as fast as he could reload. Every shot had to count, but the Germans kept coming. They were using the trees as cover, advancing in short rushes, getting closer with each movement. Then disaster struck. A German mortar round landed directly on the bunker's roof. The explosion was deafening. Concrete chunks rained down. When the dust settled, McKinney found himself alone. His 11 squadmates were dead or unconscious. Blood was running down his face from shrapnel wounds. His left ear was ringing so badly he could barely hear. But he was alive, and the Germans were still coming. Private First Class. John McKinney was now the only thing standing between 200 German soldiers and their objective. Any sane person would have surrendered. Any reasonable soldier would have retreated. But McKinney had been trained in the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Their motto was simple: no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great. He crawled to the bunker's machine gun position, a .30 caliber Browning M1919, 600 rounds of ammunition in a wooden crate beside it. The previous gunner was dead, but the weapon was still functional. McKinney had never operated a machine gun in combat before. He was a rifleman, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He checked the weapon's action, fed the ammunition belt, and waited. The Germans assumed they had eliminated all resistance from the bunker. They began advancing more boldly, calling out to each other in German, coordinating their assault on what they believed was an empty position. They were wrong. At 150 yards, McKinney opened fire. The .30 caliber rounds cut through the German formation like a scythe through wheat. Soldiers dove for cover behind trees. Officers shouted orders. But the damage was done. The confident advance had turned into chaos. For the first time since the battle began, the Germans were confused. Intelligence had told them this was a lightly defended outpost, but the volume of fire coming from the bunker suggested they were facing an entire squad, maybe more. McKinney fed a new belt into the machine gun and kept firing, short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, making every shot count. He had been taught to fire in 3 to 5 round bursts to prevent overheating. The technique was saving his life. Something remarkable was happening inside that bunker. McKinney was experiencing what combat veterans call the zone. Time seemed to slow down. His movements became automatic. Fear transformed into calculated aggression. He wasn't thinking about the odds anymore. He was thinking about targets. The German officers were trying to reorganize their men, but McKinney could hear every word they shouted. During his training, he had studied basic German military commands. Vorwärts meant forward. Deckung meant take cover. When he heard Angriff, which meant attack, he knew exactly when to fire. The psychological effect was devastating for the German troops. They couldn't understand how one American position was creating so much resistance. Some began to believe they were facing a much larger force. Fear spreads quickly in combat, and doubt was creeping into the German assault. But McKinney was running out of ammunition. He counted his remaining supplies: 200 rounds for the machine gun, 4 clips for his M1 Garand, 3 hand grenades from fallen comrades, against what he estimated were still over 150 German soldiers in the surrounding forest. The temperature was dropping. Snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. McKinney's hands were numb from the cold and the vibration of the machine gun. His uniform was soaked with melted snow and blood. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He hadn't eaten in 12 hours. He hadn't slept in 24. But he couldn't stop. Not now, not when so many had already fallen. At 9:30 a.m., the Germans launched their second major assault. This time they were more cautious, more organized. They had brought up additional machine guns and positioned them in the tree line. The plan was simple: suppressive fire to keep the American pinned down while infantry rushed the bunker from multiple angles. It was a sound tactic. Against a normal defensive position, it would have worked perfectly. But McKinney wasn't thinking like a normal soldier anymore. He was thinking like a survivor. He let the German machine guns open fire first, noting their positions by the muzzle flashes. Then, instead of returning fire immediately, he waited. He watched as the German infantry began their rush, exactly as he predicted. They were moving in 3 groups, converging on the bunker from different angles. McKinney made a split-second decision. He grabbed 2 hand grenades, pulled the pins, and threw them in quick succession toward the left and right flanking groups. Then he spun the machine gun toward the center group and opened fire. The grenades exploded simultaneously, shredding through the flanking attackers. The center group, seeing their comrades fall, hesitated for just a moment. That moment was all McKinney needed. His machine gun fire was devastating at close range. Bodies fell. Men screamed. The attack collapsed in less than 30 seconds, but the victory came at a cost. McKinney had used 2 of his 3 grenades. He was down to his last 100 rounds of machine gun ammunition, and the Germans now knew exactly where he was positioned. The German commander, a veteran officer named Hauptmann Werner Müller, couldn't believe what he was witnessing. His assault company had been stopped cold by what appeared to be a single American soldier. His casualties were mounting. His men were demoralized. But retreat was not an option. The entire offensive depended on units like his breaking through the American lines quickly. Müller made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered a 3rd attack, this time with everything he had left. At 10:45 a.m., the final German assault began. They threw everything at that bunker: mortars, machine guns, rifle grenades. The concrete structure shook with each impact. Dust and debris filled the air. McKinney crouched behind the machine gun, waiting for the inevitable infantry rush he knew would follow. And then it came. Germans emerged from the trees on all sides, screaming battle cries, firing from the hip as they charged. This was it, the final test. McKinney opened fire. The machine gun bucked in his hands, spitting death at 500 rounds per minute. He swept the barrel left to right, cutting down attackers like wheat before a harvester. Bodies piled up in front of the bunker. The snow turned red with blood, but they kept coming. Some made it to within 20 yards, 15 yards, 10 yards. McKinney grabbed his M1 Garand and his last grenade. If they breached the bunker, he'd make them pay for every inch. But then something unexpected happened. The German attack wavered. Officers were shouting, trying to rally their men. But the soldiers had had enough. They had lost too many comrades. The psychological pressure of attacking what seemed like an invincible position was too much. Men began falling back, first in 1s and 2s, then in groups, then in a general retreat. They disappeared into the forest, dragging their wounded with them, leaving their dead behind. Silence fell over the battlefield. McKinney stood in the bunker, shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, unable to believe what had just happened. He counted 43 German bodies visible from his position. Intelligence reports would later estimate his actual kill count at over 60, with dozens more wounded. One American soldier had stopped a German assault company of 200 men. It defied all logic. It defied all military doctrine. But it had happened. For the next 2 hours, McKinney maintained his position, expecting another attack at any moment. But none came. The Germans had moved on to softer targets, unwilling to waste more men on a position that had already cost them so dearly. At 1 p.m., McKinney heard American voices. His hands were so frozen he could barely raise his rifle to identify the approaching soldiers. They were men from the 26th Infantry Regiment, part of the American counterattack that was beginning to organize against the German offensive. When the American soldiers reached the bunker, they couldn't believe what they found. One man, surrounded by dead comrades, standing guard over a position that looked like it had been hit by an artillery barrage. The bodies of dozens of German soldiers littered the area. Spent ammunition casings covered the bunker floor ankle deep, and in the middle of it all stood Private First Class John McKinney, covered in blood and dirt, barely able to stand, but still gripping his rifle. The company captain approached McKinney and asked for his report. McKinney's voice was hoarse from shouting and the acrid smoke. "Sir, squad position held. 11 casualties, 1 effective." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then at the carnage surrounding the bunker, then back at McKinney. "Son," he said quietly, "you just did something I've never seen in 20 years of soldiering. You held against impossible odds. The entire American line might have collapsed if the Germans had broken through here. You saved lives today. A lot of lives." McKinney was evacuated to a field hospital where doctors treated him for shrapnel wounds, frostbite, severe dehydration, and partial hearing loss in his left ear. He spent 3 weeks recovering before being returned to duty. During that time, his company commander had written a detailed account of the action at the Belgian bunker. The report made its way up the chain of command, reviewed by battalion commanders, then regimental commanders, then division commanders, and finally to General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. 6 months later, on June 21, 1945, the war in Europe now over, Private First Class John McKinney stood in a formation at Fort Benning, Georgia. His family had been flown in from his hometown. The entire 1st Infantry Division was assembled to witness the ceremony. A general stepped forward, holding a light blue ribbon from which hung a 5-pointed star, the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But for McKinney, the medal wasn't about glory. It was about the 11 men who died in that bunker. It was about the thousands of American soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the deadliest battle in American military history. Over 19,000 American soldiers killed, over 23,000 captured, over 47,000 wounded. McKinney had been one of the lucky ones. He had survived to tell their story. When asked years later in an interview what he was thinking during those 3 hours of hell in that Belgian forest, McKinney's answer was simple and profound. "I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I was thinking about my buddies who had just died. I was thinking about the guys further down the line who were counting on us to hold. I was thinking that if I gave up that position, if I ran, then they died for nothing. So I didn't run. I did my job." The Battle of the Bulge lasted from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. It was Hitler's last major offensive of the war, a desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive initially achieved complete surprise, pushing American forces back and creating a bulge in the Allied lines that gave the battle its name. But the American soldiers, like McKinney, refused to break. They held positions that should have fallen. They fought with courage that defied explanation, and ultimately, they turned the tide. The German offensive failed. By January, the Allies had recaptured all lost ground. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic casualties it could never replace. The war in Europe would end 4 months later with Germany's unconditional surrender. And in countless small actions across that frozen Belgian forest, individual acts of courage had made the difference. McKinney's stand at the bunker was just one story among thousands, but it was a story that exemplified everything the American soldier represented: determination, courage, and an unwillingness to abandon comrades or mission, no matter the odds. Today, historians study the Battle of the Bulge as a turning point in World War II. Military academies teach it as an example of defensive operations and crisis leadership. But behind every tactical map and strategic analysis are the individual stories of soldiers like John McKinney. Young men, far from home, facing impossible situations, who somehow found the courage to do the impossible. The bunker where McKinney made his stand no longer exists. Time and weather have erased most physical evidence of that desperate fight. But the story lives on, passed down through generations of soldiers, a reminder of what one person can accomplish when everything is on the line. In war, courage is often measured by survival. But for John McKinney, courage meant standing when everyone else had fallen. It meant fighting when logic said surrender. It meant holding a position because the alternative was unthinkable. One man, 200 enemies, a snow-covered forest in Belgium. Against all odds, against all reason, he held the line. And in doing so, he became part of history. This was his story, a story the world nearly forgot, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of the American soldier. Remember their names. Remember their sacrifice. Because freedom was never free. It was paid for in blood, in frozen Belgian forests, by soldiers who refused to quit. This is their legacy. This is their gift to us. Never forget.